a member of the Connecticut Poetry Society. So we have been putting on programs like this one for actually 6 years. We began at the Hartford Public Library, and then we have partnered with other libraries around the state. And so we're really excited to be partnering tonight with the Glastonbury Public Library. And obviously your reach is far and wide. We have more people signed up for this Poets on Poetry than we've ever had, both in person or on Zoom. So I think we have found a format that seems to work very well. And as I say, I'm excited about that. What I'm going to be doing this evening is I'm going to be sharing with you a little bit of the research that I've done about Walt Whitman. And then after that, we'll go through the poem packet that Kirsty sent out to you. If you didn't get the poem packet, not to worry, because I'll be sharing my screen with you. So you'll be able to see the poems that way. And I am going to be recording this session. So if you do not want your face seen, that's fine. You can just hit stop video, which is in the lower left-hand corner of your screen, and then we will not be able to see you. And obviously, as Kirsty mentioned, we're going to be taking a show of hands for comments because there are so many of you, and we want to make sure that the things don't descend into true chaos. I'm really excited to talk about Walt Whitman this evening. He's a fascinating character. He really is. And I know many of you who are joining us may know as much or more about Walt Whitman as I do. And we are really looking forward to hearing your comments and getting your perspective. He is certainly not a poet without controversy. And so I think it's pretty cool that at least this is my last Poets on Poetry. We're having some new folks take on the project for Connecticut Poetry Society, and it may morph and form. Not exactly sure how that will be, but it's been a really wonderful run, and I've been very excited to be a part of that since its inception. So I'm going to share my screen with you. At least I'm going to attempt to do that. We'll see how well that works. Here. Okay. So this screen I'm going to do. Well, okay. Still working.
You had it.
What are you looking at Walt Whitman? Because I am not.
No, we were.
Yeah, we were. Okay. So we're going to do it again. We'll do it again. Let's see if we can find him. Not that one.
Well, that sucks.
Not to worry. We'll get it done.
Okay.
Now this is the poem. This is the poem packet. What I really want to share with you is this. Okay. So we're going to go back to the beginning of it. My problem is that I was at the end, and I'd like to be at the beginning. So I want to share first off with you a photograph of Walt Whitman. So this, for many of you who, if you've seen Leaves of Grass, you know that this is the drawing of Walt Whitman that appears in the frontispiece of his book, Leaves of Grass. And for those of you who may not know this, Walt Whitman published only one book of poetry. Leaves of Grass was published in 1855. It had 12 poems in it. He added poems to it. He continued to change his editions. If you could mute yourself, please, everybody, that would be helpful. He continued to basically add poems to the same book. So by the time he died, there were 383 poems in Leaves of Grass, as opposed to the 12 that were in it when he began. But this is the way he chose to present himself. And as you can see, he kind of looks a little bit like a working man, which is an image that he wished to cultivate. He's got an undershirt on, he's got an open-necked collar, He is kind of slouching. He's got one hand on his hip, and he's wearing kind of a like a tweed kind of a trouser. So I think the look on his face is interesting, and that he chose this for a reason. This was actually based on a photograph. He was photographed many times. We might Victor Altschul is here on the pop this evening, for which I'm really happy, because he and I did a program on Walt Whitman a number of years ago, and I took the in favor of Walt Whitman, and he took the con against Walt Whitman. And Walt Whitman, I believe, would classify probably as a narcissist, but we'll let others weigh in on that a little bit later in the evening. I want to give you just a little short bio for those of you who are not aware of his life. For those of you who are, apologies, but it will be short. So he was born in 1819 in West Hills, Huntington, Long Island. He died in 1892 in Camden, New Jersey. He was the second of 9 children, and at 4 years of age, they moved to Brooklyn. This very famous poet, at age 11, left school. He had a 3rd grade education. And essentially, he became an office boy, a printer's apprentice. He owned and or edited a number of small town newspapers. It sounds as if he might have had difficulty getting along with people, because he definitely changed jobs frequently. He tried teaching school. That was not to his liking. It just, he really did not want to be a teacher. And he found himself always kind of going back to the newspaper business. By 1850, he had begun writing the poems. He had done a little writing before that point, but he began writing poems that turned into Leaves of Grass. And you'll hear a little bit later when we talk about what other people have said of him. But it appears that from the style that he was writing before 1850 and what turned up in Leaves of Grass, he went through some kind of radical transformation. And we don't really know what happened, but what we do know is he came up with a very unique style of poetry, which was immediately apparent from his very first publication. So in 1855, he published, as I said, 12 poems. He published it under the title Leaves of Grass. The initial run was 795 copies, and he paid for it himself. So he is an example of a self-published poet. In fact, he was always a self-published poet. He never had what we think of today as a publisher. By 1856, the next year, he was ready to come out with his 2nd edition. He added 20 poems, and he also included a letter that he had received from Emerson, which was very complimentary about his first book, something completely unique and original. And what we'll learn a little bit later about Walt Whitman is he was nothing if not a self-promoter. And so he included this letter in his next edition, even though he basically had not asked Emerson whether he could do that or not. So this is basically his life until edition 1 of Leaves of Grass. In 1862, he moves to Washington, D.C., in search of his brother George. Now, he had gotten a message that someone named George Whitmore had been injured in the Civil War, and he thought that that was his brother. And he went down to D.C. to see if he could find his brother. In fact, he did find his brother, who had had a fairly minor injury to his cheek. His brother went back to the war. He did survive the war, but he was not grievously wounded, nonetheless. At that point, Walt Whitman visited some of the wounded soldiers at the hospitals in Washington, D.C. And his work in reading letters to them from people that wrote to them, writing letters for them if they were illiterate and could not write, or wounded and could not write. He brought them candy. He basically was very attentive for many years. And obviously there were grievously wounded people in in those DC hospitals. In order to keep himself alive, he worked as a low-level clerk for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. He was fired from that job in 1865, perhaps because the reputation of Leaves of Grass had been that it was not only unique and radical, but that it was obscene. And so once word got around, he found it was difficult to hold a job. He eventually ended up working at the Attorney General's office, interviewing former Confederate soldiers. And after Lincoln was assassinated, he wrote the famous elegy, "O Captain, My Captain," which we will look at this evening, partially in an attempt to burnish his image and avoid this concept that he was a disreputable character. In 1866, he met a young man, much younger than he, named Peter Doyle, who was a streetcar conductor. This was in Washington, D.C. And this is someone with whom it's possible that he had a sexual relationship. So this is a photograph of Peter Doyle and Walt Whitman, and I think it's a fascinating photograph. Again, it's enigmatic. We really can't tell what these two. It's obviously a posed photograph for one thing, but we really can't tell from the expressions on their face what their relationship is. They did write. They had a long correspondence between the two of them. And at one point, Whitman wrote later in his life to Peter Doyle saying, "Do you need to borrow money? If you need to borrow money, I'll find money for you." And of course, this is, as I say, Walt Whitman was not a wealthy man. Peter Doyle remained in one way, shape, or in another in Whitman's life until Whitman died, actually. He was at the funeral in Camden, New Jersey for Walt Whitman, but he was kind of apart from the funeral goers. The funeral itself was a bit of a spectacle. And Peter Doyle was kind of off on a hillside. So some feel that he was viewed as being certainly not educated, not a poet, not a writer. He was a streetcar driver. So that's Peter Doyle. And this is the photograph that is in the Library of Congress collection, taken sometime in 1865. So about 10 years after he first wrote Leaves of Grass. We don't have much of what Whitman had to say about Doyle, but Doyle said, this is when they first met, "We were familiar at once. I put my hand on his knee. We understood." And then Doyle goes on to say that Whitman rode with him to the end of the line. So I think it's quite fascinating to contemplate what the relationship was like between these men. My screen is getting like little lines on it. I don't even know why. It's quite interesting. Okay, so Whitman is still in Washington, D.C. when he has a stroke in 1873. He is really debilitated as a result of this. He moves back home to his brother's home in Camden, New Jersey. His mother is also in ill health. She dies shortly thereafter. And in 1876, while he is in New Jersey, he meets another young man named Harry Stafford, to whom he gave a ring. And there's a letter from Stafford saying, "I will never take this ring off until, one of us dies." So again, what was that relationship? We're not exactly sure. He finally bought his own home, 1884. Cost him $2,000. His last edition of Leaves of Grass, as I mentioned, which had 383 poems in it, was published in 1891. He died in 1892, March 26th. He was buried in a $4,000 granite mausoleum that he had designed, and even though he was in a wheelchair, he was taken out to oversee the production of this mausoleum, which eventually a number of his family members were also buried there. So I think it's quite fascinating that he spent twice as much money for his mausoleum as he did to buy his house. And it is still there. You can go and see it. So I'm going to now shift my attention a bit to talking about who Walt Whitman was as a poet. And I decided to pick 3 characteristics to share with you, and then you can weigh in and decide whether you agree or disagree. I think he was a groundbreaking poet. I think he was grandiose, and I'm sure that he is enduring. So, from the groundbreaking perspective, his style was free verse. He did not use end rhyme. Bear in mind that Edgar Allan Poe wrote The Raven in 1845. So the American audience was familiar with Poe's style of poetry. And when you think about that, and then you realize what Leaves of Grass was presenting, you can see that it really did look very radical. His diction had a lot of slang in it. It had a fair amount of just ordinary American speech. His syntax was often obscure or confusing. And Mark Doty has written a new book called What is the Grass, where he does a close reading of a number of Walt Whitman's poems. But you can really see that sometimes you're really trying to figure out who is the subject of this sentence, because the sentences tend to go on and on and on, and you're not exactly sure how to read the syntax. The topics, think about The Raven, where you have, someone who's been in love, and you have a narrative, right? You have a bird that's speaking, you have rhyme, you have meter. None of those things are apparent in Walt Whitman's work. His work appears to be more in the nature of proclamation than it is narrative. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But in a way, it's almost as if he's stating his philosophy of life. And that was not typically a subject for poetry. And finally, he was groundbreaking in that he was very forthright about the body and its passions. He talked a lot about touch, but he talked a lot about sexual relations. And that's why people thought his work was obscene, although they thought it was obscene because they were sure he was talking about women. So Mark Doty has quoted in his book. Mark Doty is a contemporary American male poet. He's gay. And in his book of essays, he's basically talking back and forth to Whitman, and he's looking underneath Whitman's language to see whether he feels that Whitman is actually writing not about women, but about men. So blind, loving, wrestling touch, sheathed, hooded, sharp-toothed touch. Did it make you ache so, leaving me? And you can see that regardless of whether he's writing about a man or a woman, he is definitely writing in a forthright way about love. Mark Doty also says that the poem Calamus was what he calls a bombshell, in that Whitman wrote, I am satisfied, he, a hold of my hand, has completely satisfied me. And Doty goes on in his book to say, in his opinion, that he is a man named Fred Vaughn, who worked on the Fulton Ferry and later on Manhattan coaches. Vaughn, again, much younger than Whitman, did live with Whitman for some time in his Classen Avenue home in Brooklyn, perhaps as a boarder, which was actually very common. So it's a little hard to know what their relationship was, but again, they had a long correspondence, and Fred wrote letters to Whitman all his life, even after Fred, had gotten married and had children. On this issue of obscenity, as I said, many people thought it was obscene. Whitman himself thought that he had lost jobs because people thought he was obscene. But I recently I read a biography of Charlotte Bronte. Now, she published Jane Eyre in 1849. So we're talking about in the same general time period. And Jane Eyre herself, talks about her love and her desire for her employer. She was lambasted by reviewers as being coarse. And the explanation for her being coarse was that her life was thwarted because she was a spinster and didn't have the opportunity to be a wife and mother, and therefore this somehow changed her and coarsened her. My point is that at the time, any language that talked about desire between men and women was really suspect. And Emily Dickinson is quoted as saying, "You speak of Mr. Whitman. I never read his book, but was told that he was disgraceful." So Doty's position is that Whitman hid the language of love and sex with men in plain view. He does his research, and he shows how Whitman changed certain words in his poems from one edition to the next in order, hopefully, to ameliorate whatever criticism he might be gathering from critics. So, for example, he had one poem where he used the word manly love, and in the next edition, he changed it to robust love. So, Doty takes this as some evidence that Whitman was aware that he needed to, whatever language he used, he needed to be aware of the critics. Oscar Wilde, by the way, Oscar Wilde did meet with Whitman. He spent an afternoon with him, and the visit was supposed to be something like 20 minutes, and Whitman said to the person who had admitted Oscar Wilde to his study, you can take the afternoon off. And the two men spent the entire afternoon together. But just, again, point of reference, 3 years after Walt Whitman's death, Oscar Wilde was, as you know, convicted of gross indecency and sentenced to prison. So we're talking about a very difficult and dangerous time to be talking about anything related to any sex, but certainly same sex. Now, my second term was grandiose. Well, as you all know, he begins Song of Myself with the words, "I celebrate myself." And Bob Hass actually has written some interesting reflection on what "I celebrate myself" might mean, because he says that the word celebrate does, and it's true, has a religious significance. It's not necessarily completely narcissistic, as we might gather. But regardless, Whitman was larger than life, and his language was larger than life, and he talked a lot about himself. He wrote his own reviews, very laudatory reviews. He sent articles to Boston papers about his Civil War charity work. Well, he was very much attuned to being his own publicist. He had many photos taken of himself. You saw that one with Peter Doyle. And as I say, he built himself a very fancy mausoleum, obviously in part to ensure his place as an important man. Is he enduring? Well, I don't think there's any question about that. He has been, just today, somebody sent me a link to a blog where he is being referred to as talking about the importance of trees in his life when he was recuperating from his stroke. But he's been the subject of many other poets' work. One that you're probably familiar with is Ginsberg, A Supermarket in California. And so I thought maybe I'd ask Peter to read that for us. If you can show up here, Mr. Peter, we will unmute you. I hope. Yes. So Peter, can you read A Supermarket in California? Maybe.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. What thoughts I have of you tonight, Walt Whitman. We walked down the side streets under the trees with a headache self-conscious looking at the full moon. In my hungry fatigue and shopping for images, I went into the neon fruit supermarket, dreaming of your enumerations. What peaches, what umbras, whole family shopping at night, aisles full of husbands, wives and the avocados, babies and the tomatoes, and you, Garcia Lorca, what were you doing down by the watermelons? I saw you, Walt Whitman, childless, lonely old grubber, poking among the meats in the refrigerator and eyeing the grocery boys. I heard you asking of each, who killed the pork chops? What price bananas? Are you my angel? I wandered in and out of the brilliant stacks of cans following you, and followed in my imagination by the store detective. We strode down the open corridors together in our solitary fancy, tasting artichokes, possessing every frozen delicacy, and never passing the cashier. Where are we going, Walt Whitman? The doors close in an hour. Which way does your beard point tonight? I touch your book and dream of our odyssey in the supermarket and feel absurd. Will we walk all night through solitary streets? The trees add shade to shade, lights out in the houses. We'll both be lonely. Will we stroll dreaming of the lost America of love, past blue automobiles and driveways, home to our silent cottage? And dear Father, graybeard, lonely old courage teacher, what America did you have when Sharon quit pulling his ferry and you got out on a smoking bank and stood watching the boats disappear on the black waters of Lee?
So it's from a style standpoint, I think it's pretty clear that the Beats owed a lot to Walt Whitman, just in terms of an exuberant kind of stream of consciousness, hell bell, tumble bumble style. And of course, here Ginsberg is also, acknowledging that, in his opinion, Walt Whitman was a homosexual eyeing the grocery boys, as of course was Ginsberg. So that he's finding a fellow spirit in Walt Whitman in a grocery store with avocados, and I just think it's a delightful poem, and again, it's an homage, right? It's an homage to someone who he says is a dear father, a gray beard, and a lonely old courage teacher. And I think that that's also a very important, point that Ginsberg makes, as a gay man himself. Oh, so this is a little bit sideways. Sorry about that. And let me see if I can do a better job of showing it to you. So there is a man named Alan Crawford, and he has written a book called Whitman Illuminated. And what you're seeing in front of you is one of his pieces. And I'm now going to show you some of the others. So this is the cover of his book. And he's taken all kinds of Whitman poems. It took him years to do this project, by the way. And he has set them to art. He's set them to art, which I think is absolutely fascinating. Now, this is a 2014 book. So this is an artist who is basically entranced, as we speak, by Walt Whitman. And again, just whimsical, but also I think just showing the effects of Walt Whitman on another artist with a completely different style of artistic expression. So to that point about being enduring, I just think that we really get that point. So I'll go back to sharing my screen. And you can see, although, that's one about love. So the other thing I wanted to share with you, and Bessie Reyna just actually called my attention to this week, so thank you, Bessie. In the North American Review, you see here on your screen, there's a citation to the link to it. They did last year in 2019. They did a project where they had 200 different people write a reflection on a line or lines from Walt Whitman. And it was headed by Brian Clements, who is actually a professor at OSCON here in Connecticut, professor of writing. And some of the reflections are actually terrific. I'm going to be reading later on one by Mark Doty, because it actually takes excerpts from his latest book and shows you really what a deep reading he conducts of Walt Whitman and his style and his precision in poetry. But the one that I wanted to show you first, let's see, was by Bessie, right here. So Bessie, did you have a copy of it to read from, or do you want to read from
Yeah, I have a copy.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. This is Bessie Reyna.
Hello, everybody. Brian Clements gave us different poems to select, to be inspired by. And when I read this first 3 lines of Whitman's poem, project I have been working on of political prisoners really came to mind. So what I ended up writing based on those 3 lines is the following. It is September 1990. I am back in Panama City, a few months after the US invasion and capture of Noriega. As I step from my hotel, the doorman warns, be careful. I run through the pouring rain to meet a political prisoner of the Torrijos Noriega dictatorship, who awaits me in an eerily darkened office building. There's no electricity. I use my lighter to find his office number. I record the words he has not shared until this moment, desperately wanting to find any trace, any truth of humanity in them. Shivering in my rain-soaked clothes, I strain to hear him calmly describe the boat ride to Coiba, the island prison for dictators' captives. Suddenly, memory and terror fills his voice. The soldiers threw all of them overboard into the shark-infested waters to die or to swim and survive, to be imprisoned and tortured. This was only the beginning of what happened to this courageous man. I have listened to his story, translated it, and I am still at a loss trying to find truth of humanity here, to understand the horrors inflicted on him. I try to see myself in prison, shaped like another man, and feel the dull, unintermittent pain he and so many others were forced to endure.
Thank you, Bessie, so much. So, if there's any question about the enduring power of Walt Whitman, Bessie, you've really given us a wonderful example of that. What was it like doing that whole project with so many other writers?
It was very interesting because when Brian invited me, and I said, of course, I would love to be part of this. When he gave us he gave me about 30 poems. So I was up at 5 in the morning reading poems and trying to see. And then when this particular one was on the screen, I just immediately connected with it in my own experience talking to these political prisoners. So I thought it was really relevant that I could use his words to explain the horror that someone else had experienced, which very few people know about what happened to prisoners in Panama City during the dictatorship.
Thank you so much. And I do have what Brian Clements said, that these are annotations. Some of them follow the conventions of the classic academic annotation, but you'll also find poems, micro memoirs, arguments, and brief essays. You will find celebrations of Whitman, laments for his failings, and rejections of him. You will find praise for his innovations and acknowledgement of his debts to other authors, other traditions. And I highly recommend it. I must say that I got badly distracted this week reading all these because they're so fabulous. And yeah, so a great project. This is another example of someone who is attracted by and writes a lot about Walt Whitman. This is a picture of Walt Whitman from a book called Specimen Days, which is, I guess, a combination of some of his prose pieces. And in this, basically, Maria Popova, who curates brain pickings, talks about how important it was to Walt Whitman when he was wheelchair bound and very ill, to be able to see the trees and to love the trees. And I think that that's one of the things we get in Walt Whitman's work, is that he really doesn't see a distinction between people and the natural world. That's that line about every atom as much belongs to me as belongs to you, right? He just has this sense that everything is connected. And I think that's really quite beautiful. This is what Mark Doty said, as they also got distracted reading Mark Doty's recent book, which is called What is the Grass? And it's essays about Whitman and Doty's life as a gay man. And here's what he says. What scandalized readers in Whitman's time was his frankness about heterosexual bodies and his portrayal of women as sexual beings. Only those alert to same-sex desire seemed capable of reading a deeper level of scandal in the poems, a secret shared in broad daylight, but largely unreadable. Whitman is ultimately a queer poet in the deepest sense of the word. He destabilizes, he unsettles, he removes the doors from the jambs. There is an uncanniness in Song of Myself. Again and again, he points us toward what it seems must remain folded in the buds beneath speech, since it cannot be brought to the surface. And I would say that this pretty much is for me anyway, is the theme of Doty's recent book, even though, as I said, he really did a wonderful job, I think, in talking about Walt Whitman's work. And I'm just going to read you to close out this portion, and then I really want to take some questions and comments from you. So Mark Doty wrote about, I celebrate myself, and what I shall assume, you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. At the beginning of the astonishing sprawl he'd later call Song of Myself, Whitman swept aside anything he'd written before. As if with one powerful gesture, he pushed off his desk everything no longer useful to him. What came crashing to the floor? His own tentative early poems and the expected forms and decorum of American poetry. Where does a poet find such courage, the will and stamina to make a radical beginning? The unsaid can be the source of an enormous pressure, a nearly physical need to say what living is like. If the poetic stances and form of the hour don't seem capable of incorporating the way the world feels, the pressure is intensified. Perhaps that's why these three opening lines of Whitman's seem to geyser out of the depths. He has waited so long for these words to emerge, as if from nowhere. I celebrate myself, and what I shall assume, you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. Thus the poet introduces the man he has become or invented to the world. Robert Hass notes that in 1855, celebrate meant more an act of religious observance. The priest celebrated the Eucharist. Then it suggested either happy affirmation or throwing a party. The poet's first action here is to praise, affirming and elevating his own body and soul. But from his second line, it's plain that the notion of self here will not go uncomplicated. And what I assume, you shall assume, is an act of performative speech. Something becomes true because a person in authority says it is. The source of this authority, at this early point in the poem, the source of this authority seems only the speaker's confidence. Assume can mean to take some premise as a given, or it can mean to take something on as to assume power, or you might take responsibility for something not originally yours, as in assuming a debt. The line could be taken as supremely arrogant. Why should we think or feel or take on the responsibilities the speaker in this poem does? How would he have any way of knowing? His assertion doesn't make sense until the line that follows. For every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. Poetic imagination isn't usually directed by the will. Some other part of the self seems to go forward on its own. Stanley Kunitz used to say his poems began in sound, and sense had to fight its way in. Whitman's poems in his early heyday seem to have begun in voice. I'd guess the new and commanding speaker and his headlong assertions simply rose up in Whitman. He'd have had to figure out who it belonged to. This tone and manner seemed to bear no relation to anything else he'd written. This speaker has two boots planted firmly on the ground and stands at his full height. The sweeping confidence in these opening lines sets the tone for the entire outpouring to follow. Who does this voice address? It seems too big and public to be directed toward a lover or a friend, and yet there's an intimacy about it too. You wouldn't say every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you to just anyone. It feels too personal for that claim of radical proximity, though it's also a sly reminder that atoms don't belong to anyone. What's a part of you today may not be tomorrow. On that level of reality, what would ownership mean anyway? These three lines also establish the poem in the present tense. Whitman's not telling us about something that already happened. His poem operates in the now and seems to report on thinking, feeling, and perception. Along the way, we'll hear short narratives of remembered experience, family stories, even the tale of a historic battle. But the body of the poem seems spoken in the moment of its composition, which lends the voice a living edge and helps to account for the poem's aura of timelessness. Because the text acknowledges the present tense of its own making, the reader seems to receive it in that same present tense, or at least a contiguous present. The poem, speaking from its continuous present into the moment of attention, seems always to know that you, its reader, are there. You will not go unseen. So as you can see, I hope I've convinced you of my 3 points: groundbreaking, grandiose, and enduring. But I'm hoping that you will use the raise hand feature and weigh in on whether you think I've convinced you or not. So, James, can you unmute yourself?
I'm trying to unmute and it's not working.
Yeah, I think people have to unmute themselves.
Okay.
So let's go on to Alice and we'll come back to James.
James is unmuted now.
Oh, good. Yay.
I think I accidentally pressed whatever it is you press.
Okay.
Because sorry about that.
That's fine.
I had the, I'm listening to you, but I had the phone in my pocket because I'm preparing dinner and stuff.
Okay.
But sorry about that.
That's okay.
No problem. So we have Alice Sawyer next.
And yet those three lines remind me very much of a way to express a combination of the women's movement and other empowerment movements. in which people have to acknowledge themselves and recognize their value and what they are able to do and everything like that.
Mm-hmm.
This is somewhere where I've always had trouble with poetry. I had a teacher, English teacher, ninth grade, feel that the only meaning of any poem had to be what they thought.
Yeah.
And
That's
I,
a good way to make you hate poetry.
well, it did a good job. I never liked English after that, although I'm a real reader. But that's what those 3 lines are to me from my modern, so to speak, point of view, although I'm hardly modern by age. So I don't know what a 30-year-old would think of this.
But your point is that you can read something into these lines that feels very relevant to you.
Right.
And I think that's the point of saying that Whitman is enduring.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like any what we call the classics in literature.
Yep. Thank you for your comment. Thank
Yeah.
you. Anybody else want to weigh in here? I've covered a lot of information. Peter? You, I think, are unmuted. Oh. Matthew. I've just asked you to unmute yourself, and I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, how's it going, Christine?
Going great.
Awesome. Yeah, this is a cool thing. I'm outside right now, so it's a very cool setting to listen to this. The one thing I was going to say was I heard a quote from Oscar Wilde that he said, Walt Whitman is not a poet, he is a prophet. And I kind of get that from Whitman's poetry. It's very kind of, I don't know if Taoist or Buddhist would be the right word, but just finding the connection between every atom and every being in the world and how we're all similar rather than different as well. So
Yeah.
that's kind of the one thing that I was thinking about during those 3 lines, kind of very, very almost religious and spiritual.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, what Mark Doty was saying is what possessed this man? Like he was writing very pedestrian stuff and then suddenly something hit him. So, yeah.
It'd be cool to read. I don't think I ever read his early poetry, but just read that first and then read after he kind of had his epiphany or poetic revelation or whatever. It'd be cool to compare the 2.
Good point.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Matthew, nice to see you.
Hey, Bessie.
Laura said hello.
Lauren says hello.
Anybody else want to comment on what we've gone over so far? We're gonna take a look at some of the poems, so that should be interesting. Yeah, Laura.
I just think it's so interesting that Emerson was so fond of his work, because Emerson was a transcendentalist and he believed in the interconnectedness of everything, and that it really is so that it's almost as if Whitman was poeticizing what Emerson's philosophy was.
Yeah, and he was very entranced by, Emerson and Thoreau, and so it wasn't that he was really a loner. What I think is so fascinating is he was basically completely self-educated, right? I mean, the man, he left in the 3rd grade and somehow managed to, get himself into Emerson's lectures and whatnot. I just think it's remarkable. He obviously had a very big personality. Anyone else? Anyone else want to say anything before we go on and look at some poems? All right. Okay. Well, let's see if I can get.
I think there's one more question.
I think I'm unmuted.
Yep.
Hi, I'm Betty Bono. I'm tuning in from Norwalk, and thank you so much for this program. I wrote a novel actually set in part during the Civil War, and for the 3 years I was writing, I carried this book with me because although it was not about Whitman per se, his voice is so evocative And I think, Christine, in your talk, you captured really something important about him, that he was revolutionary in a certain way, but he also was very much of his time, but his time is also right now. And I'm absolutely convinced in your points he is enduring. And I found so much inspiration just for tone and setting and the feel of the time. And you know, I like "Oh Captain, My Captain" as, you know, one of his poems, but I actually like the other poem he did about Lincoln, "When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed," you know, which is much longer and heavier and stranger in a certain way, and not a, you know, not a popular poem. But every time I would pick this up, it wouldn't matter how much of it I had read, how many times I had read it, it was alive. It was absolutely alive and relevant. And when I saw that this program was going on, I was like so excited. So thank you so much for this.
Oh, good. We're glad you're here. This is terrific. I know I see a lot of faces that I don't know, and that's a really good sign. Oh, and by the way, you can always go to ctpoetry.net and you can find out what the Connecticut Poetry Society is up to next by way of presentations. So let me now get us to look at some of the poems before we, that's the bio. I don't want that. Okay, let's see. Where is it? Where is it? Where is it? Here we go. Here we go. So, as you can see, the first poem that I have on your screen, it comes from Song of Myself. By the way, Song of Myself was not what he called the first poem in his first version of Leaves of Grass. He called it, I think, Walt Whitman, An American. And he also did not separate sections into numbers. He did that later on in his work. So, you know, he definitely, as I say, and Mark Doty definitely makes this point in his book, Whitman was constantly revising. He was like an indefatigable reviser, which makes him very near and dear to my heart, since that's one of the things I am too. So I'm hoping, Pat Matola, can you read the section 1 for us? She may no longer, yeah, she's here. No. Okay.
Okay now?
Yes.
Okay. 1. I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. I loaf and invite my soul. I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spear of summer grass. My tongue, every atom of my blood, formed from this soil, this air, born here of parents, born here from parents the same, and their parents the same. I, now 37 years old, in perfect health, begin, hoping to cease not till death. Creeds and schools in abeyance, retiring back a while, sufficed at what they are, but never forgotten. I harbor for good or bad. I permit to speak at every hazard. Nature without check, with original energy.
Thank you, Pat. You know, one of the things I noticed about this poem is that he says, I'm observing a spear of summer grass. And I'm thinking back to the last Poets on Poetry we did of Mary Oliver, where she's just, you know, looking at the grass. And as you know, grass actually plays a very large role in Whitman's poetry. Doty points out that grass is a slang term for type in a typesetter. I think it's the type that didn't work that you have to throw out, or there's something wrong with the type didn't, the ink didn't fill it completely or whatever, and that's called the grass. So it was just one of those fun little tidbits of information that may mean something or maybe nothing. But I did notice that. Pat, is there anything you noticed about it that you wanted to point out?
Oh, I'm on the spot.
No, you're not. You can say no, nothing.
That line also captured me, observing a spear of summer grass. Isn't that what poets do, is they observe everything about everything? That's all I have to say.
And again, one of the points that Mark Doty makes is that the I seems very specific in Whitman's poems, but we never are quite convinced who he's writing to or who he's talking to. And of course, that makes all the difference. I mean, is he talking to a specific you? Is he talking to everybody? Is he proclaiming something that's very large to a large audience? We don't really know. So let's go on to 5, because we're going to look again at the issue of the soul when we get to the noiseless patient spider. And Whitman was not known to be a religious man. He wasn't a churchgoer, but I think he believed there was a spirit that was within all of nature. I think that's pretty clear from his writings. So Tony Fusco, could you read this part, number 5?
I'd rather not, Christine.
Sure. Laura Elchel?
Okay. Got it. I believe in you, my soul. The other I am must not abase itself to you, and you must not be abased to the other. Loaf with me on the grass. Loose the stop from your throat. Not words, not music or rhyme I want, not custom or lecture, not even the best. Only the lull I like, the hum of your valved voice. I mind how once we lay such a transparent summer morning, how you settled your head athwart my hips and gently turned over upon me and parted the shirt from my bosom bone and plunged your tongue to my bare stripped heart and reached till you felt my beard and reached till you held my feet. Swiftly arose and spread around me the peace and knowledge that pass all the argument of the earth. And I know that the hand of God is the promise of my own. And I know that the Spirit of God is the brother of my own. And that all the men ever born are also my brothers, and the women my sisters and lovers. And that a kelson of the creation is love, and limitless are leaves stiff or drooping in the fields, and brown ants in the little wells beneath them, and mossy scabs of the worm fence, heaped stones, elder, mullein, and pokeweed. My.
Right? And that second stanza just kind of builds in energy, right? And I know that the hand of God, and I know that the Spirit of God, and that all the men ever born, and the ands and the ands and the ands, and then he's finally down to, the weeds in the field, right? The elder, the mullein, and the pokeweed, which I just think is really quite a stretch, right?
Yes. And loafing in the grass, it's so physical.
Right.
And then the body is God to him in a way.
Mm-hmm.
It's spiritual too. But this is a very, very definitely male physicality to male, I think.
Yeah, I think it's kind of hard to imagine the person settling the head on his hips being a woman, parting the shirt from my bosom bone and plunging your tongue to my bare stripped heart.
And feeling his beard. Yeah, I just,
Yeah.
it's robust as it's robust love.
Yeah, and what's so fascinating is that this really went under the radar. Like, people did not pick up on this. They were much more offended by thinking about what he had to write about women. So I don't know. We look at it now and it's pretty obvious to us. But
Yeah.
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 But I just love that, you know, and again, this is his writing style. It's a very, it's kind of an over the top, almost like a railroad train is going down the track with that last stanza there, which I think is pretty much a hallmark of a lot of his writing.
And it's all happening in the grass. So that's the other thing.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah, love looking in the grass.
So the 6 is probably one of his most famous sections of Song of Myself. And Beverly Greenspan, are you willing to read that for us? I saw you. I know you're there.
Okay, I'm here.
Thanks.
A child said, "What is the grass?" fetching it to me with full hands. How could I answer the child? I do not know what it is any more than he. I guess it must be the flag of my disposition, out of hopeful green stuff woven. Or I guess it is the handkerchief of the Lord, a scented gift and remembrancer, designedly dropped, bearing the owner's name some way in the corners, that we may see and remark and say, whose? Or I guess the grass is itself a child, the produced babe of the vegetation. Or I guess it is a uniform hieroglyphic and it means sprouting alike in broad zones and narrow zones, growing among black folks as among white, Canuck, Tuckahoe, Congressman, Cuff, I give them the same, I receive them the same. And now it seems to me the beautiful uncut hair of graves.
So again, wow. You go all the way from the child at the beginning, asking an innocent question, right? What is the grass? And we're all the way down at the end to, well, right before we get to the beautiful uncut hair of graves, we've got a very wide, expansive stanza that encompasses everyone, right? Everyone that we know of. And he's got specific names, but he's basically saying, it encompasses all people. And I think it's a fascinating poem. I think it's also really interesting to see the handkerchief of the Lord dropped for us to what? Pick up and say, oh, you dropped your handkerchief. You know, can I make your acquaintance? You dropped your hanky. Where did he get that from? Anything you want to comment on, Beverly? I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I just think it's a fascinating piece.
Yeah, I agree. It's remarkable the way it goes from the child to the people who have died and are in their graves. It's you know, it again reemphasizes this theme of Whitman that everything is connected and everything,
right.
You know, that all people are connected and have have the same things that belong to them.
Mm-hmm.
That everybody belongs to the same things.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's really quite beautiful. Of course, it assumes that grass is available to everyone, which may not be as true today as it was back then. But I think it is a beautiful poem. So this is a noiseless patient spider, and one of the reasons I like it is that it is much more in form. It uses a number of the poetic forms that were available to him. So he certainly has the ability to write this way if he chooses to. It's short. It's just 2 stanzas. And it's, back to the point about writing about the grass or the pokeweed, it's written about a spider, which I think is really quite fascinating choice. So let's see. Laura Mazza-Dixon, can you read it for us?
Okay. A noiseless patient spider. A noiseless patient spider. I marked where on a little promontory it stood isolated. Marked how to explore the vacant vast surrounding. It launched forth filament, filament, filament out of itself, ever unreeling them, ever tirelessly speeding them. And you, O my soul, where you stand, surrounded, detached, in measureless oceans of space, ceaselessly musing, venturing, throwing, seeking the spheres to connect them, till the bridge you need will be formed, till the ductile anchor hold, till the gossamer thread you fling catch somewhere, O my soul.
Different approach, right? Different in tone, much more questioning than proclaiming. And I find it fascinating that he's actually writing a poem where instead of on the earth with the grass and the bugs and the whatever people, he's in space, right? He's imagining, right? He's imagining that this spider that's sending out this tiny, tiny thread is actually somehow going to connect the soul to the spheres, seeking the spheres to connect. I think it's a beautiful image, but it's both a very large image and a very small image, both at the same time. And for me, I like his use of poetic elements. For example, filament, filament, filament. We don't see a lot of that kind of repetition in Whitman. We do see some of the, run-on sentences that begin with an and constantly, but we don't see him repeating a word in the middle of a poem, typically the way he's doing here. And I also loved the use of the gerunds, musing, venturing, throwing, seeking. We've got, again, it's kind of a piling on of those gerunds, which creates a sense of energy in the poem. And, normally his energy comes from being effusive and kind of being stream of consciousness. But here he's doing it strikes me in a much more calculated way. And I find it to be a very interesting example of what he can do in kind of working in different form. Anybody else have any thoughts about that? Would you say, Laura, that from reading this poem, you think that Whitman thinks he has a soul or he doesn't have a soul, or you can't tell?
Well, I think the last 2 lines are the motivation for the poem.
Mm-hmm.
So I think he looks at the spider doing the spider's
job, reaching out into this vast surrounding and creating something out of itself. And then he's I think he's talking to himself, and he's saying, you know, you'll be throwing this line out, trying to connect all these things until you get what you need, until the anchor holds, until the gossamer thread you fling catch somewhere. So I think when he says soul, he's just talking to himself.
Mm-hmm.
But he has definitely this idea of the soul. I mean, going back to the first one we read this evening, the soul, he's got the soul set against the physical self, I think. In that
But
line
the
back.
point you just made, I really, really liked, which is I hadn't thought about that the spider is creating the web out of itself. It's actually producing this, you know, this thread that's seeking something.
And I think he sees himself doing the same thing, but he's left his body out of this equation. So when in number 5 he says, "I believe in you, my soul, the other I am must not abase itself to you, and you must not be abased to the other." So his idea of his soul is his own consciousness, and his body is a little bit separate from that. In this poem, I think it's all about his consciousness.
Yeah.
His
Yeah.
existence in this expanse of space, and what's going to tie him to it? What
Right.
be the security? He has to make his own security.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Laura, what did you want to say?
That was me saying that.
Oh, sorry. Now I'm going to Laura Altschul. I apologize. There's more than one. Yeah.
Okay. It could be also about his poetry reaching out and his writing and wanting that connection with the reader.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and
Yeah.
Vic wanted to say something.
Only to second that
Yeah.
he can't endure his unbearable loneliness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is quite a sense of loneliness in this poem. Thank you. You're right. You're absolutely right. Yeah. And I think he was a very lonely man in many respects. Yeah. You know, they say that his stroke was the result of nursing all those wounded Civil War soldiers, that's what took the toll on his health. And, you know, we don't know whether that was the case or not. When he died, his lungs had, I think, 1/8 of their capacity. So, yeah, so he was not a healthy man. Thank you. Matthew, speak to us.
Yeah, I was actually going to lower my hand because I think that everyone kind of said what I was going to, but I feel like this poem is definitely more kind of meta, like a poet writing about the art of poetry than we saw before. And I think that, you know, in this poem, it's almost like the spider was his way into the poem to think about his own process of writing. And a poem to me is kind of like if you have a feeling or an emotion that you can't quite describe, and then a poet comes along and says a certain line or a certain stanza really rings out to you and you can relate to it. It's almost kind of the spider web or the anchor that allows you to stay grounded or kind of get a perspective on the feeling you're not able to express yourself.
Good point. Linda, you wanted to speak? You're on. But you have to unmute yourself.
Audio.
There you go. Good.
I just thank you for having this. I found out about through Facebook.
Oh,
and
good.
I don't have any connection at all. This poem to me tells me that he is intuiting the meaning of the cosmos in a sense, the meaning of life, through an intuitive way. Now, I think today of like quantum physics, things are connected, but his way of understanding that how to find meaning is that it has to come from within through the seeking process. You have to come from your soul. It's not going to come from outside. It's not going to come from something in your head. Or religion or something that he didn't have. He didn't have that formation type of thing. But I think he's intuiting the similar dynamics of many, seekers, writers or not, just seeking.
Yeah, I do agree with you that I think a lot of his poetry feels like philosophy. It feels like some sort of a worldview that he's kind of trying to work out for himself. Yeah, very good point. Bill?
I had 2 points, one of which I think has already been made, but just quickly to repeat it. I think he's the spider, the poor little tiny spider in the field is reaching out, reaching out, reaching out. But you know what? I'm a poor tiny spider reaching out, reaching out, reaching out, except that I'm not in a field. I'm in the middle of the cosmos reaching out. I think that point was made, but I'd like to make a point I don't think was made, which is the jump. There's a big space between paragraph 1 and paragraph 2, and to me, there's a jump there. The first paragraph deals with a spider, and then there's a huge jump, a completely big jump, where he shifts over to talking about himself. And it's kind of like a spider stretching out its filaments, and he doesn't know where they're going to land. I mean, he could be in one tree, and that filament could land in a completely different tree. And when it does, that's a jump from one tree to another. It's a random jump. The spider doesn't know where it's going to land. He just takes it wherever it does land.
It takes faith. It takes some kind of faith. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's what happened here. He jumped from the spider to himself because that's where he ended up landing.
Very nice. Good point. Yep. Also a poetic device. Big turn in the poem. Thank you. Beverly.
Yeah. So I found myself thinking of that famous poem by Emily Dickinson where she says the soul selects its own society and shuts the door. And I was feeling like what Whitman is saying in this poem is the opposite of that. That rather than saying this, that the soul, the mind, the personality, the person, whatever, should select what they want and shut the door, that they have to reach out and try to reach as much as they can, the whole universe, keep throwing out filaments into what's around you and bring in and connect yourself to as much as you possibly can connect yourself to, which I think I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah, thank you. Tony?
Yeah, for me, the first part about the spider is kind of the material world he's seeing. He's looking at it and he's thinking. And the second part is about philosophy, but it's kind of like what's going to become of us, what is there, what's spiritually. And it's about faith because, what the spider does, making the web, it's instinct, it's natural, it's been built into them, over centuries and centuries and centuries. It just does it, right? But what you do as a person that thinks, what is coming after this? What is after this? You throw out that filament. Is it going to catch somewhere? You don't know. Mm-hmm. The spider doesn't need to know. The spider's faith is just instinct. But with a person, you kind of want to know. Is it going to go somewhere? Is it going to connect to something?
You want to know.
Yeah. He's got two outstanding lines. The one about the filament is definitely, and then the last line, of course, is a real killer in this poem. And I like this so far the best because it's the one I can understand. I'm not confused by what I'm reading.
I hear you. I definitely hear you. Thanks, Tony. Kathy, you're up.
Hi, everybody. So many great things have been said, and I think it was Laura who was saying that she thought the spider and Whitman were the spider represented Walt Whitman in a way, and he identified with him. I was looking at some of the words that caught me, and noiseless. There's a silence. There's a loneliness and a quiet. If you've ever gone out and looked at a spider web as it's being created, and just that silence. Patient.
Mm.
And then where is it? Vast. Just this sense of amazement of this web, and like Tony had said, the faith that's required. And with filament, I think this might have also been said, filament, filament, filament. It's like it's spewing, spewing, spewing as when it builds its web. And then when Whitman speaks of himself, the words that stick out to me are ceaselessly throwing. So he, like the spider is throwing the filament, he is throwing whatever it is, his need or his searching. And someone else had mentioned about connecting. So to me, it's about connecting, and it's about the tentativeness and the fragility. For all his robustness, I see a much more likable, if that's the right word, a much sympathetic individual here than perhaps in some of the other pieces that we've looked at. And the last thing I'll say is that last line, which I agree with Tony, it's really a killer. When he says, you fling the gossamer thread, you fling, catch somewhere. Again, the randomness of it. So that was all I wanted to say.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We're running out of time, which is very sad. And I do want to read a little bit of I Hear America Singing. So because what I want to do is, again, to the point about enduring, I can see a lot of echoes from this poem in two inaugural poems that were read by Richard Blanco and Elizabeth Alexander at the two different inaugurations of Barack Obama. So I'll just read this. I Hear America Singing. I hear America singing the very carols I hear, those of mechanics, each one singing his as it should be, blithe and strong. The carpenter singing his as he measures his plank or beam, the mason singing his as he makes ready for work or leaves off work, the boatman singing what belongs to him in his boat, the deckhand singing on the steamboat deck, the shoemaker singing as he sits on his beach, the hatter singing as he stands, the woodcutter's song, the plowboy's on his way in the morning, or at noon intermission, or at sundown, the delicious singing of the mother, or of the young wife at work, or of the girl sewing or washing, each singing what belongs to him or her and to none else. The day, what belongs to the day, at night the party of young fellows, robust, friendly, singing with open mouths their strong, melodious songs. Now, we'll just have a couple minutes to look at a little bit of this. But you can see that when Richard Blanco wrote One Today, he did a very similar thing, which is he talked about lots of different people and lots of different places, but going to work, the dailiness of life, what are we doing here? One sun rose on us today, kindled over our shores, peeking over the Smokies, greeting the faces of the Great Lakes, spreading a simple truth across the Great Plains, then charging across the Rockies. One light, waking up rooftops, under each one a story, told by our silent gestures, moving behind windows. My face, your face, Millions of faces in morning's mirrors, each one yawning to life, crescendoing into our day. Pencil yellow school buses, the rhythm of traffic lights, fruit stands, apples, limes, and oranges, arrayed like rainbows, begging our praise. Silver trucks heavy with oil or paper, bricks or milk, teeming over highways alongside us, on our way to clean tables, read ledgers, or save lives, to teach geometry or ring up groceries, as my mother did for 20 years, so I could write this poem. And similarly, Praise Song for the Day by Elizabeth Alexander. Again, each day we go about our business. Third stanza, someone is stitching up a hem, darning a hole in a uniform, patching a tire, repairing the things in need of repair. Someone is trying to make music somewhere with a pair of wooden spoons on an oil drum with cello, boombox, harmonica, voice. So I think both these poets were basically echoing that expansive sense of, I hear America singing, right? All the different Americas doing all the things in their daily life, the plowboy, etc. And I think that, again, this is one of my exhibits, if you will, for my proposition that Walt Whitman truly is an enduring poet and, deserves to be recognized as someone who did something really quite radical for his time. Because as you can see, it's taken a long time and people are still engaging with him in ways that I think are really, really beautiful. So we don't have time to read Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, but again, I think it's probably one of his best known poems. And one of the things I had wanted to point out is look at section 3. It avails not time nor place, distance avails not. I am with you, you men and women of a generation, or ever so many generations hence. And he has been spoken of as a poet who echoes the Bible. But you can see at the bottom, I am with you and not absent from you, not at a distance. I am a very present help, which comes from one of the Psalms. And there's a Mark Doty in his book also refers to a lot of other language in Walt Whitman poems that does sound very biblical in cast. So it's, he learned from what came before him, and we have learned from him. And I just think it's wonderful to see that those little gossamer threads are connecting, right? They're connecting all of us together as we look at poetry and enjoy it and think about someone who has been called the father of American poetry. So we may like him as our dad, or we may not like him as our dad, but he definitely still has an enduring influence. So I'm happy to take any last questions or comments. As far as I'm concerned, we don't need to leave at 7:30, but I know some of you have places to go and things to do. So please feel free to sign off if you need to. And if you want to say something, I'm happy to hear it.
Hello, can you hear?
Yes.
You can hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Everything I think from Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, I sing, Hear America Singing, the 2 Obama poems, it all is really summed up pretty much in the first 3 lines of the Song of Myself. I celebrate myself and I sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume, and every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. Whitman may be a narcissist in saying I celebrate myself, but he's also a transcendentalist. And when he says I celebrate myself, he celebrates everybody and everyone. So when all those people are singing, the carpenter, the mason, the woodcutter, they are him and he is them, and everything is connected. That's Patient Spider, that filament finally got connected, and we are one and we are unified. And especially in a divided universe, even that we have right now in the country before even the pandemic, I couldn't help reading the political poems in the Obama and everything and seeing, once again, the unity. And Whitman, I think, really would have liked those poems, not only the way they were written, but also with the thematic nature of every individual being connected. And he's also Emerson, as Laura was saying before. Emerson once said, if one person looks very deeply into your own self, into your own heart, that's where you meet everybody else, because that's where we have our commonality, not necessarily in all the external things, but we're all human deep inside. And I just think that just summarizes Whitman beautifully. I love him.
Thank you so much. Got a few more comments we'll take. Linda Lodka. Was I even close on pronouncing your name?
That's pretty good. Yes. I really am glad we got to these poems for the end because I've always respected Walt Whitman for his patriotism and living during a real crucial time, you know, when the Civil War was going on. So I kind of always looked at him more like, you know, a patriot and, you know, supporting the war. And as much as we've talked about all the other aspects of his poetry, I never really thought of him as being, you know, self-serving or anything. I don't know why. I just always kind of thought of it as like global messages and things like that. But I just wanted to say that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think he does very much speak to our time. So,
Yeah.
Laura Altschul or Vic, not sure who.
Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to thank you. I think this has been an absolutely outstanding presentation.
Yeah.
I've learned a great deal. Thank you.
I would just like to say you have been fabulous for all the pops, and we're going to miss you.
Thank you so much. It's been my privilege. It really, really has. I love doing this. Yeah.
Well, we loved having you do it. You are quite a class act, I have to say.
Thank you so much, Altschul. Thank you. Matthew, speak to us.
Yeah, thank you for doing this again. This was an awesome way to spend a Thursday night. I appreciate it. Yeah, I was actually going to say, like, I feel like, you know, that on a artistic level, any artist in any genre, poetry, you can either write to be famous and be well known, or you can write to help other people. And I think every artist wants to be famous, wants to be well known, but on a non-narcissistic level, we also want to help everybody as well and help people get through tough times and find that connection that we all have. So I think we're constantly battling that desire to be famous and well known and have our art admired and talked about, like we're talking about Walt Whitman's. And we also want to write a helpful poem that will get someone through a tough day or help them sort out feelings or just find that universal connection that we all share. So I think that we're all, as artists, we all kind of balance out those two extremes, and some tend to go more away than another. But at the end of the day, all art, after the artist has passed away, kind of is left for us to decide that. So I was just thinking about that with him. And I do think that, yeah, he was narcissistic, but I mean, I see that in myself as well, but maybe not as much as that.
Yeah, we could probably, I guess all writers can own a little bit of that. That's okay too, right? Thank you, everybody, for being with me this evening. I really, really appreciate it. And we will, we hopefully will get this presentation up on YouTube. So if you want to take a look afterwards, you may. And the Mary Oliver presentation is also now up on YouTube. So I'll be happy to send you all a link to that if you'd like, and you can revisit that again. So thank you, everybody. Good night. Have a nice evening. And thank you for joining me. Happy to have you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Christine.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. It's really
Thanks.
That's great.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, good night.
How come we're still up there?
Because I didn't leave the meeting. Yeah.